On June 28, 1914, a 19-year-old named Gavrilo Princip fired 2 shots in Sarajevo. Within 5 weeks, the entire continent of Europe was at war. But here's what most people don't understand about that moment. The war didn't start with those gunshots. It started years earlier. It started with treaties signed in private rooms, with railroads built to move armies, with colonies claimed on maps, with speeches about national destiny and industrial output charts showing one empire catching up to another. The assassination wasn't the beginning. It was the point where everything that had already been set in motion became impossible to stop. Now consider where we are today. Right now, there are active military operations on 3 continents involving nuclear-armed powers. The global economy has been weaponized. Trade routes that kept the world connected for decades are being contested by warships. Alliances are forming that haven't existed since the Cold War. And in capitals around the world, generals are updating war plans that were considered unthinkable 10 years ago. This video is going to show you something most people haven't fully processed yet. World War III is not coming. It's not a future possibility we need to prevent. It's a process that has already started, and by the time you finish watching this, you'll understand exactly why. When people imagine a world war, they picture a single dramatic moment, a declaration of war, an invasion broadcast on live television, a flash of light over a city. But that's not how the first 2 world wars actually began. World War I didn't start as a world war. It started as a regional dispute between Austria-Hungary and Serbia. It became continental because of treaties. It became global because of colonies and shipping lanes and economic dependencies that pulled in nations from Japan to Brazil. World War II started even more gradually. Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931. Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1935. Germany remilitarized the Rhineland in 1936. Spain erupted into civil war that same year, with German and Soviet forces fighting on opposite sides. By the time Germany invaded Poland in 1939, armed conflict had already been spreading across the globe for nearly a decade. The formal declarations came late. The process started early. Now look at the present. Since 2014, there has been armed conflict in Ukraine involving Russian forces. Since 2015, a war in Yemen with Saudi Arabia and Iran backing opposite sides. Since 2011, Syria has been a battleground for Russian, American, Turkish, Iranian, and Israeli military operations. In 2020, a war between Armenia and Azerbaijan drew in Turkish drones and Russian peacekeepers. In 2023, conflict erupted in Gaza, pulling in Iranian proxies across Lebanon, Yemen, Iraq, and Syria. These are not isolated events. They are connected by the same set of tensions, the same collapsing agreements, the same competition between the same major powers. What we are witnessing is not a series of separate regional conflicts. It is the early phase of a larger systemic war that has not yet been named. After 1991, the world operated under a set of assumptions. The Cold War was over. The Soviet Union had dissolved. The United States was the only remaining superpower, and a new international order emerged based on a simple premise. American military dominance would guarantee global stability, and in exchange, nations would follow a set of rules. Rules about trade, about borders, about how disputes would be settled. For about 2 decades, this system mostly held. But systems don't last forever, and this one began breaking down long before anyone wanted to admit it. The 2003 invasion of Iraq was conducted without United Nations authorization. The 2008 financial crisis revealed the fragility of the Western economic model. The 2011 intervention in Libya was framed as humanitarian, but resulted in regime change and a collapsed state. The 2014 annexation of Crimea showed that territorial conquest was possible again in Europe. Each of these events chipped away at the foundation of the post-Cold War order, and each time the response was inadequate. Sanctions were imposed, statements were issued, but the underlying violations were absorbed. The system adapted rather than enforced. What this created was a new reality. The rules technically still exist. Nations still reference them in speeches and legal arguments, but in practice, the rules no longer constrain the most powerful actors. What matters now is capability. What matters is leverage. What matters is what you can take and what you can defend. The international order has not been replaced by something new. It has simply stopped functioning. And into that vacuum, competition has returned. For most of human history, there was no single dominant power on Earth. Different empires controlled different regions. Wars were fought constantly to adjust borders and spheres of influence. The period from 1945 to 1991 was unusual. Two superpowers divided the world between them. Their competition was intense, but it was also structured. Each side understood where the other's red lines were. The period from 1991 to roughly 2008 was even more unusual. A single power dominated the entire global system. American military spending exceeded that of the next 10 nations combined. American financial institutions set the rules for global trade. American cultural products reached every corner of the planet. That period is now over. China's economy has grown from 10% of American GDP in 1990 to roughly 75% today. Russia has rebuilt its military and demonstrated willingness to use it. Regional powers, Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia, India, are pursuing independent foreign policies rather than aligning with Washington. The world has shifted from one pole to many poles. And historically, this kind of transition is one of the most dangerous moments in international politics, when existing institutions were designed for one balance of power, but reality has shifted to another. There is no mechanism to peacefully manage the transition. The institutions become obstacles rather than solutions. The rising power sees them as tools of the declining power. The declining power sees any reform as surrender. This mismatch between the world as institutions describe it and the world as it actually exists is the structural cause of the instability we are living through. Every great power has a zone it considers essential to its security, a region where it will not tolerate hostile forces, a sphere where it insists on influence. For the United States, this has historically meant the Western Hemisphere. The Monroe Doctrine of 1823 declared that European interference in the Americas would be treated as an act of aggression. For nearly 2 centuries, this principle has guided American foreign policy. For Russia, the equivalent zone is the former Soviet space, the countries that were once part of the USSR or the Warsaw Pact. When NATO expanded eastward after the Cold War, absorbing Poland, the Baltic states and others, it moved directly into the zone Russia considers non-negotiable. For China, the essential zone is the waters off its coast, Taiwan, the South China Sea, the island chains that control access to the Pacific. When these zones overlap with the interests of rival powers, conflict becomes almost inevitable. Ukraine sits in Russia's claimed sphere, but it also sits on the border of NATO's expansion. The war there is not simply about Ukrainian territory, it is about where the boundary between Russian and Western influence will be drawn. Taiwan is claimed by China as its own territory, but it is also protected by American security guarantees and produces over 90% of the world's most advanced semiconductors. A conflict there would be about far more than the island itself. The Middle East sits at the intersection of 3 continents. Whoever controls it influences trade between Europe and Asia, access to oil, and the balance of power across the entire Eastern Hemisphere. These regions are not incidental to great power competition. They are the locations where competition becomes confrontation. The nuclear age created a paradox. Great powers now have the capability to destroy each other completely. But precisely because of this capability, they cannot fight each other directly. A conventional war between nuclear-armed states carries the risk of escalation that no leader is willing to accept, so they fight differently. They fight through proxies, through allies, through partners and militias, and local forces armed with their weapons and guided by their advisors. In Ukraine, American and European military equipment is operated by Ukrainian soldiers against Russian forces. The Western powers are not formally at war with Russia, but their weapons are killing Russian soldiers, and Russian missiles are destroying equipment supplied by NATO. These measures are presented as alternatives to war, but they are not neutral actions. They are acts of economic warfare designed to damage rival states without firing a shot, and increasingly, they provoke military responses. When the United States uses the dollar's dominance as a weapon, it gives every other country a reason to find alternatives. When shipping lanes are used to enforce sanctions, it gives targeted nations a reason to develop the capability to contest those lanes. The weaponization of trade and finance does not prevent military conflict. It sets the stage for it. It demonstrates hostile intent. It damages economies in ways that populations feel directly. And it forces rivals to either accept subordination or prepare for a different kind of confrontation. Beneath the surface of political disputes lies a harder reality. The modern world runs on materials that are not evenly distributed. Oil and natural gas, lithium and cobalt, rare earth minerals, semiconductors, fertilizer, grain. The nations that control these resources have leverage. The nations that depend on them are vulnerable. Europe discovered this in 2022 when Russian gas stopped flowing. Energy prices spiked, industries shut down, governments scrambled to find alternatives. China has worked for decades to secure access to resources in Africa, South America, and Central Asia. Its Belt and Road Initiative is not primarily about infrastructure. It is about supply chains, about ports and pipelines, and mining concessions that ensure Chinese factories can keep running regardless of what the United States does. The United States has responded by trying to reshore critical industries and secure its own supply chains. The CHIPS Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, massive subsidies for domestic production of semiconductors and batteries and critical minerals. This is not cooperation. This is competition. And when competition involves resources that entire economies depend on, it does not stay economic for long. Maritime choke points become strategic flashpoints. The Strait of Hormuz, the Strait of Malacca, the Suez Canal, the Panama Canal. Any disruption to these passages affects global trade within hours, and every major power is now investing in the ability to disrupt them, or to keep them open by force. There is a reason most of human history's largest conflicts have been fought in Eurasia. The combined landmass of Europe and Asia contains the majority of the world's population, the majority of its resources, the majority of its industrial capacity. Whoever controls Eurasia, or prevents any single power from controlling it, shapes the future of the planet. American strategy since 1945 has been built on preventing any single power from dominating Eurasia. This was the purpose of NATO, the purpose of alliances with Japan and South Korea, the purpose of military bases stretching from Germany to Okinawa. But something has changed. China and Russia, after decades of mutual suspicion, have moved closer together. Their partnership is not an alliance in the traditional sense, but it represents a level of cooperation that directly challenges American strategy. If Eurasian powers integrate economically, militarily, technologically, the United States faces a fundamentally different world, one where its geographic isolation becomes a disadvantage, where its network of alliances is insufficient to maintain dominance, where the center of global power shifts permanently eastward. This is not a hypothetical scenario. It is the trajectory we are on, and preventing it has become the central organizing principle of American foreign policy, even if this is rarely stated openly. The Middle East has never been a stable region, but it has always been a consequential one. When oil was discovered in the Persian Gulf, the region became essential to the global economy. When Israel was established, it became a flashpoint between Western and Arab interests. When the Iranian Revolution happened, it introduced a third pole of competition. Today, the Middle East is more volatile than at any point in decades. The conflict in Gaza has expanded into Lebanon. Houthi forces in Yemen are attacking commercial shipping in the Red Sea. Iran and Israel are engaged in direct military strikes against each other's territory. American forces in Iraq and Syria are under regular attack. None of these actors can afford to back down without losing credibility. All of them have patrons or allies who are invested in the outcome. If the Strait of Hormuz is closed, even temporarily, oil prices will spike globally. If a war breaks out between Israel and Iran, it will not stay between Israel and Iran. The Middle East functions as a fuse. Conflicts there do not remain local. They spread through energy markets, through alliance commitments, through refugee flows, through terrorist networks. What happens in this region affects the price of gasoline in Ohio and the stability of governments in Europe. And right now that fuse is burning. Every war in history has exceeded its original scope. World War I was supposed to be over by Christmas. The generals had plans, the politicians had timelines. The war lasted 4 years and killed 20 million people. The invasion of Iraq was supposed to take weeks. Mission accomplished was declared in May 2003. American forces remained for 8 more years, then returned again in 2014. Afghanistan was invaded to destroy Al-Qaeda. 20 years later, the Taliban controlled the country again. Leaders always believe they can keep conflicts limited. They believe in precise strikes and manageable escalation, and off-ramps that can be taken when objectives are achieved. But wars have their own momentum. Each escalation is justified as a response to the enemy's provocation. Each new weapons system is defensive. Each expansion of the conflict is temporary. Each step makes sense in isolation, and each step makes the next step harder to avoid. Right now, American weapons are striking targets inside Russia. Russian missiles are destroying American-supplied equipment. Chinese ships are shadowing American carriers in the Pacific. Iranian proxies are attacking American forces in the Middle East. Each side believes it is acting carefully. Each side believes it understands where the red lines are. Each side has systems and doctrines and protocols designed to prevent miscalculation. But the space for miscalculation is growing, and the mechanisms designed to prevent catastrophe are the same mechanisms that failed before every war people thought could be avoided. When historians study the origins of world wars, they find patterns, rising powers that have outgrown existing arrangements. In 1914, Germany had surpassed Britain as Europe's largest industrial economy, but still lacked the colonial empire and naval dominance that Britain possessed. The mismatch between German power and German status created resentment. The alliance system meant that a regional dispute became a continental catastrophe. In 1939, Germany had recovered from defeat, but remained constrained by a treaty system designed to keep it weak. Japan had industrialized, but was denied access to resources controlled by Western empires. Italy sought to restore Roman glory. Each believed the existing order was unjust. Each believed force could revise it. Now look at today. China has become the world's largest manufacturing economy, but remains excluded from the institutions that govern global finance and technology. Russia has rebuilt its military but remains surrounded by an alliance it views as hostile. Regional powers from Turkey to Iran to India are pursuing their own interests in defiance of American preferences. The existing order was designed for a world where American dominance was unquestioned. That world no longer exists, but the order has not been updated to reflect this reality. This is the structural condition that preceded both previous world wars, and it is the structural condition we live in now. When conflicts become serious, complexity becomes intolerable. In peacetime, analysts can discuss competing interests and historical grievances and legitimate security concerns on all sides. In wartime, there is only good and evil, only aggressors and victims, only democracy and tyranny. This is not a criticism of one side. It is a description of how all sides behave when stakes are high. Russia describes its invasion of Ukraine as a defensive operation against NATO encirclement. The West describes it as unprovoked aggression against a sovereign democracy. China describes its claims in the South China Sea as historical rights. Its neighbours describe them as illegal expansion. Each narrative contains elements of truth. Each narrative excludes elements that complicate the story. And once a narrative becomes dominant, it becomes almost impossible to question. When the enemy is pure evil, negotiation becomes immoral. When the cause is righteous, sacrifice becomes mandatory. When the story is simple, anyone who introduces complexity is suspect. This is how nations mobilize for war. It is also how they lose the ability to end wars. Because ending a war requires acknowledging that the enemy has interests that must be accommodated. And once the enemy has been defined as evil incarnate, accommodation becomes unthinkable. The narrative trap is not a bug in human psychology. It is a feature. It allows societies to sustain the sacrifices that war demands. But it also prevents the realistic assessment of costs and consequences that might stop a war before it becomes catastrophic. Great powers do not decline only because of external pressure. They decline from within. The United States today is more politically polarized than at any point since the Civil War. Its infrastructure is aging. Its healthcare system costs more and delivers less than any comparable nation. Its educational system produces declining results. Its life expectancy has fallen while rising in other developed countries. These are not signs of a healthy superpower. They are signs of a society under strain. Russia faces demographic collapse. Its population is shrinking. Its economy remains dependent on resource extraction. Its political system has eliminated meaningful opposition. China faces its own challenges. A property bubble that has already burst. A demographic transition that will shrink its workforce for decades. Political centralization that stifles adaptation. The European Union cannot agree on basic questions of integration. Its largest economy, Germany, is deindustrializing. Its southern members remain trapped in debt. Its eastern members fear abandonment. When great powers are internally weak, external conflict becomes tempting. War unites populations, it distracts from domestic failures, it justifies emergency measures that silence opposition. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is a pattern visible across history. Declining empires fight wars they cannot win because the alternative, addressing internal decay, is politically impossible. Something has changed in how populations relate to their futures. Birth rates have collapsed across the developed world, in the United States, in Europe, in Japan, Korea, and China. Young people are not having children at replacement rates. In some countries, they are not having children at all. This is not simply an economic calculation about the cost of raising families. It reflects something deeper. A loss of confidence that the future will be better than the present. A sense that sacrifice for future generations is pointless, when those generations may face worse conditions than their parents. When societies lose faith in the future, they become unwilling to fight for it. They become unwilling to sacrifice for abstract goals. They become focused on immediate consumption rather than long-term investment. This exhaustion does not prevent war, but it shapes how wars are fought. It creates a preference for proxy conflicts rather than direct commitment, for drones rather than infantry, for sanctions rather than invasions. It means that when major wars do occur, they will be fought by the remaining young of aging societies, or outsourced to populations still willing to sacrifice for national purposes. And it means that the domestic support for sustained conflict is fragile. Casualties that previous generations absorbed will trigger political crises in exhausted societies. This does not make war less likely. It makes wars harder to fight and harder to conclude. In a healthy political system, policy failures lead to course corrections. Bad decisions are examined, alternatives are considered, dissent is valued as a source of better information. In a system under stress, this process breaks down. Dissent becomes disloyalty, alternative viewpoints become threats. Analysts who question official narratives find their careers ending. Journalists who report inconvenient facts face accusations of working for the enemy. This is happening now, across multiple countries, in multiple political systems. The range of acceptable opinion narrows, the questions that can be asked shrink. The possibilities that can be considered become fewer. When a nation enters a conflict with a narrowed debate, it loses the ability to recognize when strategies are failing. It loses the ability to see opportunities for de-escalation. It loses the ability to understand how its actions appear to others. Strategic blindness follows, and strategic blindness in an age of nuclear weapons is not an abstraction. It is an existential risk. Empires rarely accept decline gracefully. The British Empire after World War II clung to possessions it could no longer defend. The Suez Crisis of 1956 revealed the reality, but even afterward, withdrawal was slow and reluctant. The Soviet Union in the 1980s could not acknowledge that its system was failing. The acknowledgement came only when collapse was already underway. Denial is not stupidity. It is a rational response to an impossible situation. Acknowledging decline means accepting reduced status. It means telling populations that the future will be smaller than the past. It means admitting that sacrifices were made for a position that cannot be sustained. No political system is designed to deliver this message, so the message is not delivered, and the adjustments that might allow managed decline are not made. Instead, force replaces legitimacy. When an empire can no longer attract allies, it tries to compel them. When it can no longer afford its commitments, it borrows. When it can no longer win wars, it defines victory differently. This is where we are. The global order that existed after 1991 was built on American dominance. That dominance is eroding. But the institutions, the assumptions, the expectations, they remain calibrated to a world that no longer exists. The adjustment will be made. The only question is whether it will be made through conflict or through recognition of changed reality. World War III will not look like World War II. There will probably be no single front line stretching across a continent. No million-man armies charging fixed positions. No formal declarations followed by mobilization orders. Instead, there will be what we already have. Multiple simultaneous conflicts. Proxy wars that escalate and de-escalate. Economic warfare that damages civilian populations. Cyber attacks that disable infrastructure. Periods of intense fighting followed by frozen standoffs. This will not end quickly. The conditions that created this instability, the power transition, The collapsed institutions, the exhausted societies, the resource competition will not be resolved by any single battle or treaty. We are entering a period that may last decades, a period where the distinction between war and peace becomes meaningless, where every trade deal is a strategic calculation, where every election is a battleground, where every alliance is a question mark. There is no path back to the world of 1995. In 1938, most people in Europe believed there would not be another war. The memory of the last one was too fresh. The costs were too well known. Surely rational leaders would find a way to resolve their differences,